The Steelton courtroom buzzed, thick with sweat and whispers, as Judge Clarence Monroe's gavel cracked the air. Aisha Brooks, a black woman in a grey suit, stood unbowed as the jury freed her from Officer Victor Hayes's assault charge. Hayes's smug face twisted into a snarl, fists whitening while the room exploded. Aisha's steady gaze met his, hiding a storm. He hissed to his partner, "She'll pay." The half-won victory rippled with danger. What would his revenge unleash on her life? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, hit like and subscribe for more stories that demand truth. Aisha Brooks stepped out of the Steelton courthouse into a late afternoon heavy with the smell of rust and coal dust, the city's industrial heart still beating faintly through its cracked streets. Her braided hair swayed slightly in the humid breeze, catching the last glints of sunlight as she walked, shoulders squared, jaw tight. She was 42, retired from the Navy SEALs after 20 years of covert missions in deserts and jungles, her body a map of scars she kept hidden beneath. A faded green jacket. Now she just wanted quiet, a life pieced together in this crumbling Pennsylvania town where the steel mills had long gone silent. The trial was supposed to be the end of it, a clean break from Officer Victor Hayes's lies. She'd been accused of assaulting him during a late-night stop, a claim so flimsy the jury saw through it in 3 hours. Not guilty, she'd won. Or so she thought. Her boots crunched over gravel as she cut through a narrow alley off 4th Street, the air thick, with the tang of oil from rusted machinery abandoned decades ago. Steelton wasn't kind to newcomers, especially not to a black woman who didn't bow her head. She'd felt the stares since moving here 6 months back, the whispers from porches and corner stores, the way eyes lingered too long at the grocery checkout. But she'd faced worse, stared down rifles in hostile villages half a world away. This was nothing. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag, her fingers brushing the worn leather, a habit from years of checking gear before a drop. Her mind was already shifting to dinner, maybe a quick run along the riverfront, when a low growl cut through the quiet. Tires on asphalt. She turned her head just enough to catch the black and white cruiser easing up behind her, its engine purring like a predator stalking prey. Aisha slowed her pace, her pulse steady, years of training keeping her calm, even as her gut tightened. The cruiser rolled closer, its headlights flicking on despite the lingering daylight, pinning her in their glare. She stopped, planting her feet on the uneven pavement, and waited. The driver's door creaked open, and Officer Victor Hayes stepped out, his polished boots gleaming against the grime of the street. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut that sharpened the edges of his pale face. His blue eyes glinted with something dark, a fury that hadn't been there in the courtroom, or maybe she'd just missed it behind his mask of confidence. He adjusted his belt, the clink of his handcuffs loud in the stillness, and took a step toward her. 2 other cops climbed out behind him, younger, leaner, their smirks matching his. She recognized one from the trial, a wiry guy with a scar over his eyebrow who'd sat in the back row, nodding at Hayes's every word. "Evening, Brooks," Hayes said, his voice smooth but laced with venom, the kind that dripped slow and burned deep. He stopped 5 feet from her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, far enough to keep his hands free. "Nice day for a walk, huh?" His lips twitched into a half-smile, but his eyes stayed cold, locked on hers like he was measuring a target. Aisha didn't flinch. "It was," she replied, her tone even, her hands loose at her sides. She'd learned long ago not to give men, like him, the reaction they craved. Her dark brown eyes held his, unblinking, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers hovered near his holster. She catalogued it all, a mental checklist from years of assessing threats. He was angry, humiliated, and that made him dangerous. "Funny thing," Hayes went on, stepping closer, his boots scuffing the pavement. "You think you're some big shot now, don't you? Walking out of that courtroom like you own this town." He tilted his head, the smile fading. "But Steelton don't work like that. Not for people like you." Her jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just heading home, officer. No trouble here." She shifted her weight slightly, ready to move if he pushed it, though she hoped it wouldn't come to that. Not yet. Hayes chuckled, a low grating sound that sent a ripple of unease through the air. Home, huh? Let's make sure you get there safe. He nodded to the wiry cop who stepped forward, pulling a flashlight from his belt. Mind if we check that bag of yours? Routine stop. Aisha's eyes narrowed. Routine, she repeated, her voice flat. I don't consent to a search. She knew her rights, had memorized them long before she ever set foot in a courtroom. She also knew Hayes didn't care. Don't need your consent, Hayes snapped, his patience thinning. Probable cause, you're loitering in a high-crime area. Hands where I can see 'em. He gestured sharply and the wiry cop moved in, yanking her bag from her shoulder before she could react. She tensed, her muscles coiling, but held herself back. Fighting now would only give him what he wanted. The cop rummaged through her bag, tossing out a water bottle, a folded map, her keys, letting them clatter to the ground. Then he paused, his hand dipping deeper, and pulled out a slim leather wallet, one she'd never seen before. He held it, up triumphant, his scarred eyebrow arching. Well, look at this, somebody's been busy. Aisha's stomach dropped. That's not mine, she said, her voice cutting through the thickening air. She stepped forward, but Hayes blocked her, his hand slamming against her chest, pushing her back. Stay right there, he barked, his fingers digging into her. Sternum for a split second before he let go. He snatched the wallet from his partner, flipping it open to reveal a stack of 20s and a driver's license that didn't belong to her. Stolen property, Brooks. Reported missing this morning. From a shop 2 blocks over. Guess you didn't walk away as clean as you thought. Her mind raced, piecing it together. He'd planted it. The trial loss had stung him, and this was his payback, quick and dirty. She locked eyes with him, her voice low and firm. You know that's not mine. You put it there. Hayes laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed off the brick walls. Prove it, sweetheart. He tossed the wallet to the third cop, a stocky guy with a buzzed head who'd stayed silent until now. Bag it. She's coming with us. Before she could speak again, Hayes grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with a force that made her grit her teeth. She could have broken his hold, snapped his wrist with a flick of her training, but she didn't. Not here, not with 3 of them, and a story already written. The wiry cop slapped cuffs on her, the metal biting into her wrists, while the stocky one shoved her bag into the cruiser's trunk. Hayes leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. You think you're untouchable? Think again. They hauled her to the precinct, a squat brick building on the edge of town where the fluorescent lights buzzed like flies trapped in a jar. The booking room stank of sweat and stale cigarettes, the walls plastered with faded wanted posters curling at the edges. Aisha stood silent as they fingerprinted her hands steady despite the cuffs, her eyes scanning the room. The desk sergeant, a paunchy white guy with a graying mustache, smirked as he typed up the report. Theft, huh? Should have known. You'd slip up sooner or later. She didn't respond, her lips pressed into a thin line. Hayes hovered nearby, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk circling a wounded animal. The other cops milled around, their voices overlapping in a chorus of jeers. Court let her off once, won't happen twice. Always the same with her kind. Should have locked her up the first time. The words stung, but she'd heard worse, felt worse. She focused on the clock ticking above the desk, its hands crawling toward 8. They'd process her, set bail, and she'd be out by morning. That's what she told herself. Hayes stepped forward, his boots thudding, against the chipped linoleum, and leaned against the counter, his voice dropping low. You're not walking away from this one, Brooks. I've got eyes everywhere. You step out of line again, I'll know. He straightened, brushing imaginary dust off his uniform, and flashed a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Enjoy your night in the cage. They shoved her into a holding cell, a 6x8 box with a stained mattress and a toilet that reeked of rust and neglect. The door clanged shut, the sound reverberating in her skull, and the lock clicked with a finality. That settled over her like a shroud. She stood in the center, her breath slow and measured, her mind already working. This wasn't about theft, it was about him. Hayes, humiliated in court, his badge tarnished by her not guilty verdict, wasn't done. He'd framed her, turned a routine stop into a trap, And now she was here, caged like an animal while he laughed outside. Aisha sank onto the mattress, the springs groaning under her weight, and rested her head against the cold cinder block wall. Her fingers traced the edge of her cuff, feeling the metal's bite, a reminder of how fast freedom could vanish. She'd faced ambushes before, stared down death in moonless nights. But this was different. This was personal. A war waged not with bullets, but with lies, and Hayes held the upper hand. For now. Her eyes narrowed, glinting in the dim light. She'd survived worse than him, outlasted men who thought they could break her. He didn't know who she was, not really, but he would. She clenched her fists, the resolve hardening in her, chest like steel forged in fire. This was just the first strike, and she'd be damned if it was the last. Aisha Brooks sat in the Steelton holding cell, her back pressed against the gritty cinder block, the faint hum of the precinct filtering through the bars like a distant storm. Her wrists ached from the cuffs, now removed, leaving red welts. She rubbed absently while staring at the flickering bulb overhead. It was just past midnight, the clock's hands dragging through the hours since Officer Victor Hayes had framed her for theft with a planted wallet. She'd been here before, not in a cell but in tight spots, sand-swept bunkers, jungle traps, where survival meant keeping her head clear. This was no different. She'd beaten his first lie in court, and she'd beat this one too. Her lawyer would come through. He had to. The cell block door clanged open, jolting her from her thoughts, and a guard with a sagging gut shuffled in, keys jangling. "Brooks," he grunted, his voice rough as gravel. "Bail's posted, you're out." He unlocked the door, stepping back with a sneer that curled his chapped lips. Aisha stood, her movements smooth despite the stiffness in her legs, and followed him out, her boots echoing on the scuffed linoleum. The precinct buzzed with late-night chaos, drunks shouting, phones ringing, but she kept her focus forward, her dark eyes scanning for threats. Hayes wasn't there, his absence a small mercy, though she knew he'd hear about this soon enough. In the lobby, Jamal Pierce waited, his wiry frame hunched over a stack of papers, his brown skin glistening with sweat under the harsh lights. At 28, he was fresh out of law school, his tie crooked, his glasses slipping down his nose. He'd taken her case pro bono after the assault trial, driven by a mix of idealism and grit she respected, even if his hands shook when he spoke in court. He looked up as she approached, relief flooding his face. "Aisha," he said, his voice, a nervous whisper. "I got the bail down to $500, pulled some strings with a friend at the clerk's office. We'll fight this, okay?" She nodded, her expression unreadable, though a flicker of gratitude warmed her chest. "Good. Work, Jamal. What's next?" She kept her tone steady, masking the exhaustion creeping into her bones. Freedom tasted sweet, but she knew Hayes wouldn't let it last. Jamal shuffled his papers, glancing around like he expected Hayes to burst through the walls. "We've got a hearing in 2 days. I'll file a motion to dismiss. Planted evidence? No probable cause. We can win this." His voice wavered, but his eyes burned with determination. "Let's get you out of here." They stepped into the muggy night, Steelton's skyline a jagged silhouette against a moonless sky. The air clung to her skin, thick with the scent of river mud and diesel, as they walked to Jamal's beat-up sedan parked across the street. Aisha breathed deep, savoring the open space, the absence of bars. She'd made it out. For now, that was enough. Jamal unlocked the car, tossing his briefcase in the back, and she slid into the passenger seat, her body finally relaxing against the worn upholstery. "Thanks," she said softly, the word carrying more weight than she let on. He flashed a shaky smile, starting the engine. "Don't thank me yet. Hayes is pissed. We've got a—" His words cut off, as a sharp crack split the air, followed by a shattering crash. Glass exploded inward from the driver's side window, showering them both in jagged shards. Aisha ducked instinctively, her seal reflexes snapping her head below the dash, her heart pounding as she scanned the darkness. Jamal yelped, clutching his arm where a splinter had sliced through his sleeve, blood seeping dark against his shirt. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, his voice high and panicked, his glasses askew as he fumbled for cover. Aisha's eyes, darted to the street, catching a glint of movement, a figure retreating into the shadows of an alley 50 feet away. Then she saw it, a brick lodged in the driver's seat where Jamal's head had been seconds ago, its edges stained with dust and malice. "Stay down," she ordered, her voice a steel blade cutting through his fear. She kicked her door open, sliding out low, her body coiled like a spring as she crept around the car. The street was empty now, save for the hum of distant traffic and the rustle of wind through the skeletal remains of a nearby mill. She edged toward the alley, her senses razor-sharp, picking up the faint crunch of gravel under retreating boots. Hayes, or his lackeys. She couldn't see him, but she felt his presence, a venomous thread woven into the night. Jamal's breathing. Hitched behind her, his hands trembling as he crawled out, glass crunching under his knees. "Aisha, we need to go now." His voice cracked, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the attack. She turned back, her jaw tight, and saw the fear etched into his face, the blood dripping down his arm. He was right, chasing shadows wouldn't help, not yet. She helped him up, guiding him to the passenger side, and took the wheel herself, the engine sputtering to life as she peeled out. The brick stayed lodged in the seat, a silent promise of more to come. They drove in tense silence, the city blurring, past, until she pulled into a dimly lit lot near Jamal's apartment on the east side. She killed the engine, her hands steady on the wheel, and glanced at him. "Are you okay?" He nodded, wincing as he pressed his sleeve against the cut. "Yeah, just shaken. That was meant for me, wasn't it?" His voice was small, the question hanging heavy between them. "Probably," she said, her tone flat, but her mind racing. Hayes hadn't wasted time. The courtroom loss, the planted wallet, and now this. A brick through a window to silence her lawyer. It was a warning, a flex of power. And it had worked. Jamal's hands shook as he gathered his papers, his confidence fracturing like the glass scattered across the back seat. She stepped out, scanning the lot, her senses still on high alert. "Get inside. Lock your doors. I'll handle this." Her words were firm, a lifeline she threw him despite the storm brewing in her gut. He hesitated, then nodded, stumbling toward his building, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows. Aisha waited until his door clicked shut, then walked the half-mile to a gas station, her jacket pulled tight against the damp air. She needed a phone. Hers was still at the precinct with her bag and a plan. The clerk, a bored teenager with acne scars, barely glanced up as she bought a burner and dialed a friend from her SEAL days, a logistics guy named Marcus who owed her a favor. "Need a place to crash," she said when he picked up, her voice clipped. "Steelton's heating up." "Say no more," Marcus rumbled, his baritone steady. "Got a spot near Harrisburg. Be there in an hour." She hung up, pocketing the phone, and started walking again, her boots pounding the pavement. As the night deepened around her, but the victory she'd felt leaving the precinct was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease. She'd gotten out, sure, but at what cost? Jamal's blood stained her memory, his fear a mirror to the city's cowardice. Hayes wasn't just coming for her. He was targeting anyone who stood with her, breaking them one by one. She spotted him then across the street, leaning against his cruiser under a flickering streetlight, his smirk visible even from 100 yards. He didn't move, didn't chase her, just watched, his presence a taunt she couldn't ignore. He'd orchestrated the brick, maybe even thrown it himself, and now he was savoring the chaos. Isha's fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms as she kept walking, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She'd tasted freedom for a moment, thought she'd slipped his grasp. But this was Steelton, his town, his rules. The bail was a fleeting win, a breath before the plunge, and now Jamal was hurt, maybe broken. She reached the edge of town, the river's murmur faint in the distance, and stopped, her breath clouding in the cool air. Hayes had drawn blood, not hers, but close enough to sting. What kind of man attacked a lawyer just to prove a point? She knew the answer. A coward with a badge and a grudge. Her resolve hardened, a fire kindling in her chest. She'd get Jamal back on his feet, fight the theft charge, and bury Hayes in his own lies. But as she slipped into the shadows, heading for Marcus's safe house, she couldn't shake the weight of that brick, the message it carried. Hayes wasn't done. He'd hit harder next time, and she'd have to be ready. If you think Aisha deserves justice after this betrayal, drop a number 1 in the comments. Agree that Hayes is a snake who needs to pay? Hit that like button. Want to see her fight back against this corrupt cop? Subscribe now for the next chapter of her battle. What will Hayes do to top a brick through a window, and can Aisha outsmart him before he strikes again? Aisha Brooke slipped into the safe house near Harrisburg just as dawn broke, the sky a bruised purple over the rolling Pennsylvania hills. Marcus, her old SEAL buddy, had left the key under a cracked flower pot, and she let herself into the small cabin, its wooden walls creaking with age. The place smelled of pine and dust, a far cry from Steelton's industrial rot, and for a moment, she let herself breathe. She'd walked the last 5 miles after hitching a ride from the gas station, her legs aching but her mind sharp, replaying the night's chaos. Jamal's bloodied arm, the brick lodged in his car seat, Officer Victor Hayes' smirk under that streetlight. They churned in her gut like a storm she couldn't outrun. She dropped her burner phone on the table, its screen dark, and sank onto a sagging couch, her body begging for rest. But sleep wouldn't come, not yet. She'd called Marcus from the road, keeping it brief, and he'd promised to swing by later with supplies. For now she was alone, the cabin's quiet, a stark contrast to the precinct's clamor. She needed to regroup, get back to Steelton, and pull Jamal together for the theft hearing. Hayes had framed her with that wallet, and now he'd attacked. Her lawyer, a coward's move to scare them off. But she'd faced worse, ambushes in Kandahar, midnight raids in the Congo, and she'd always come out standing. This was her fight now, and she'd hit back, hard. She closed her eyes, picturing her real home, the row house on Elm Street where she'd settled 6 months ago. It wasn't much, peeling paint, a leaky faucet, but it was hers, a sanctuary of Navy medals pinned to the wall, faded photos of her team, a folded flag from her last mission. She'd head back there once the heat died down, reclaim what was hers. The day passed in a haze of planning, her mind mapping out moves like a mission briefing. She showered in the cabin's rusty stall, the cold water jolting her awake, and changed into a spare shirt Marcus had left, its sleeves loose on her lean frame. By late afternoon, she caught a bus back to Steelton, the 40-minute ride a blur of grey fields and smokestacks. She kept her head low, her braided hair tucked under a cap, her eyes scanning every passenger for Hayes' shadow. The bus dropped her on the city's edge, and she walked the last mile, the familiar stench of coal dust and river mud settling over her like a shroud. Elm Street loomed ahead, its row houses slumped together like tired soldiers, and she quickened, her pace, eager for the familiar creak of her front door. But something was wrong. The air thickened as she turned the corner, a faint haze blurring the streetlights, a sharp tang cutting through the usual grit. Smoke. Her stomach lurched, and she broke into a run, her boots pounding the cracked sidewalk, her heart slamming against her ribs. She rounded the bend and froze. Her house, her sanctuary, was a roaring inferno, flames licking up the walls, windows shattering in bursts of glass and heat. The fire was alive, a beast devouring everything she'd built, its orange tongues curling around the roof where her bedroom had been. Black smoke billowed into the night sky, choking the stars, and the heat hit her like a slap, forcing her back a step. Aisha stood rooted, her breath shallow, her fists clenched as the fire's roar drowned out the world. Neighbors clustered across the street, their faces lit by the glow, their whispers a low hum she barely registered. "Troublemaker," one muttered, a white woman with curlers in her hair, her arms crossed tight. "Brought this on herself," said another, a grizzled man in a stained undershirt, his eyes hard. No one moved to help, no one called out. They just watched, their silence a wall she couldn't breach. She scanned the crowd, her SEAL instincts kicking in, searching for a threat, a clue. Then she saw them. 3 figures in dark jackets, slipping. Away down an alley, their laughter drifting back like a taunt. Hayes' crew. She knew it in her bones. The fire truck's siren wailed in the distance, too late to matter, and she forced herself to move, circling the house to the backyard where the flames hadn't fully reached. Her hands shook, not from fear, but fury, as She climbed through a shattered window, the glass slicing her palm, blood dripping onto the singed floor. The living room was a ruin, the couch a smoldering heap. Her medals melted into warped husks on the mantel. She coughed, the smoke clawing at her throat, and pushed deeper, her boots crunching over charred wood. In the kitchen, she found it, a scrap of paper pinned under a brick, its edges curling from the heat. She snatched it up, her eyes stinging as she read the scrawled words, "You're nothing now." Hayes's handwriting, she'd bet her life on it, the same jagged script she'd seen on his court papers. She stumbled back outside, the note crumpled in her fist, her lungs burning as the fire crew finally rolled up, their hoses blasting water that hissed against the blaze. The crowd parted, their stares cold, and she stood there, drenched in sweat and soot, watching her past turn to ash. 20 years of service, memories of her team, the quiet she'd fought for, gone in a night. Hayes hadn't just framed her. He'd torched her life, a calculated strike to break her spirit. She could hear his voice in her head, that smug drawl from the precinct. "You're not walking away from this one." He'd meant it, and now he'd proven it. Aisha's knees buckled, but she caught herself, her training snapping her upright. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fall. The firefighters shouted orders, their voices muffled by the fire's roar, and she backed away, her eyes locked on the wreckage. Her medals were gone, her photos, the flag she'd carried through hell, all ash. But she wasn't. She was still here, still breathing, and that was enough. Her mind raced, piecing together the attack. Hayes had tracked her, waited until she was gone, then sent his goons to light the match. The neighbors' apathy was no surprise. Steelton was his town, its people too scared or too prejudiced to care. She'd seen it in their eyes at the trial, felt it in their silence now. She turned from the blaze, her boots crunching glass as she walked down the street, the heat fading at her back. The safe house was her only option now, but she couldn't stay there long. Hayes knew she'd run, knew she'd fight, and this was his answer, a gut punch to strip her bare. She clenched the note tighter, its words searing into her memory. "You're nothing now." He was wrong. She was something, someone he couldn't fathom, a woman forged in fire hotter than this. Her SEAL training surged through her, a lifeline. In the chaos, reminding her of nights spent crawling through mud, dodging bullets, outlasting odds no one else could. This was no different. The river loomed ahead, its dark waters glinting under the streetlights, and she stopped, her breath steadying. As the adrenaline ebbed, she'd lost everything, her home, her peace, but not her will. Hayes thought this would crush her, make her run or beg, but he'd misjudged her. She'd rebuild, not a house, but a plan. She'd find Jamal, get him back in the fight, and take Hayes down piece by piece. The fire had taken her past, but it couldn't touch her resolve. Her fingers loosened on the note, letting it fall into the gutter, its ink smearing in a puddle. She didn't need it. She knew who'd done this and why. Aisha glanced back one last time, the flames shrinking as the firefighters gained ground, the crowd thinning into the night. Her chest tightened, a pang of loss she couldn't shake, but her eyes hardened, glinting with a fury she hadn't felt since her last mission. Hayes had escalated this war, turned it personal, and she'd answer in kind. She'd survived deserts and jungles, men with guns and men with bombs. A cop with a match was nothing. She turned toward the bus stop, her stride firm, her mind already plotting the next move. He'd burned her house, but he'd lit a fire in her too, one he'd regret starting. Aisha Brooks woke to the sound of birds outside the Harrisburg safe house, their chirps a fragile contrast to the chaos churning in her chest. The cabin's wooden floor creaked under her bare feet as she paced, her braided hair loose and wild after a sleepless night. Her row house was gone, reduced to ash by Officer Victor Hayes and his crew, the memory of flames licking up her Navy medals searing her mind. She'd lost everything, her sanctuary, her past, but not her fight. She flexed her bandaged hand, the cut from the glass still throbbing, a reminder of what she'd crawled through. Steelton wasn't done with her, and she wasn't done with it. Hayes thought he'd broken her, but he'd only sharpened her edge. She brewed coffee in Marcus's dented pot, the bitter steam grounding her as she mapped out her next move. Jamal Pierce, her lawyer, was shaken, his bloodied arm and shattered. Car window proof of Hayes' reach, but she needed him back in the game. The theft charge hung over her, a lie stitched together with that planted wallet, and the hearing was tomorrow. She couldn't fight it from hiding. She sipped the coffee, its heat scalding her tongue, and stared out the window at the rolling hills. Running wasn't an option. She'd faced death too many times to flinch now. A seal didn't retreat, she adapted. Hayes wanted her silent, erased, but she'd make noise he couldn't ignore. By noon, she was back in Steelton, the bus dropping, her near the river, where the city's pulse thrummed through cracked pavement and rusted steel. She wore a borrowed jacket from Marcus, its grey fabric masking her frame, her cap pulled low. Her burner phone buzzed. Jamal, texting a shaky, "I'm okay, meet me at the diner on 5th. She found him there, hunched in a corner booth, his glasses fogged with grease from the fryer, his arm in a sling. He looked up as she slid in, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and dread. "Aisha," he whispered, his voice raw. "I thought you'd bolt after the fire." "Not my style," she said, her tone steady, though her fingers tightened around her mug. "We've got a hearing to win. Hayes doesn't get to run me out." Jamal nodded, but his hands trembled as he shuffled papers, his bravado frayed. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "He hit you to scare us. We hit back harder, publicly." His brows shot up. "Publicly? How?" She didn't answer, just stood and motioned him to follow. They walked 3 blocks to WSTN, the local news station, its brick facade sagging under years of neglect. Aisha pushed through the glass doors, her boots echoing in the lobby, and marched to the reception desk. The clerk, a young woman with a bored stare, barely glanced up. "I need airtime," Aisha said, her voice cutting through the hum of a TV playing in the corner. "Now." It took 20 minutes of arguing and a call to a producer, but they got her in. A live segment, unscripted, raw. She stood under the studio lights, her cap off, her braids framing her face, her dark eyes piercing the camera. Jamal hovered behind her, clutching his notes, his sling stark against his rumpled suit. The anchor, a middle-aged white guy named Ted with a fake tan, introduced her with a skeptical smirk. "We've got Aisha Brooks here, recently acquitted of assaulting an officer, now facing theft charges. What's your story?" Aisha didn't flinch. She leaned into the mic, her voice steady, resonant, a blade slicing through the air. "My story's simple. Officer Victor Hayes lied about me in court, got humiliated when the jury saw through it, and framed me for theft with a wallet he planted. Last night he burned my house to the ground because I wouldn't break." The studio went silent, Ted's smirk faltering as she pressed on. "I've lived in Steelton 6 months, kept to myself, but Hayes saw a black woman who wouldn't. Bowen, he's been hunting me since. This isn't justice, it's revenge, and he's using his badge to get it." The words hit like a punch, raw and unfiltered, her gaze unyielding as the camera zoomed in. Jamal stepped forward, his voice shaky but firm. "We've got evidence. The wallet's a setup, the fire's arson. We're fighting this in court. Tomorrow." Aisha nodded, her presence filling the room, a quiet storm that dared anyone to look away. Ted stammered, "That's quite a claim," but she cut him off. "Not a claim, truth. Check the ashes on Elm Street if you doubt me." The segment ended, the lights dimming, and Aisha walked out, Jamal trailing her, his breath quickening. Steelton buzzed within hours, phones lit up with calls to the station, social media erupting with hashtags, a justice for Aisha trending local. Some cheered her, others sneered, calling her a liar, a troublemaker. But the noise was deafening. She felt it, standing on the sidewalk as dusk settled, the city's pulse shifting. She'd won something, a voice, a crack in Hayes' armor. People were listening, and that was power. She holed up in a cheap motel on the city's edge, a $20 room with peeling wallpaper and a bed that sagged like a hammock. Jamal had gone home, promising to prep for the hearing, his sling a grim reminder of their stakes. Aisha sat on the mattress, her burner phone glowing with news clips of her broadcast, her face plastered across screens. She allowed herself a flicker of triumph, a breath of hope. Maybe this would turn the tide, force Hayes to back off. She showered, the lukewarm water stinging her cut hand, and lay down, her body sinking into the lumpy springs, her mind drifting toward a plan. Sleep tugged at her, a rare surrender when the door rattled. She snapped upright, her SEAL instincts flaring, her hand reaching for a non-existent weapon. Footsteps thudded outside, heavy and deliberate. Then a fist pounded the high wood. "Police, open up!" The voice was sharp, unfamiliar, not Hayes but one of his pack. Aisha rolled off the bed, crouching low as the door burst open, splintering at the hinges. 3 cops stormed in, their flashlights blinding her, their boots stomping the cheap carpet. "Aisha Brooks, you're under arrest," the lead one barked. A stocky guy with a shaved head and a sneer she recognized from the precinct. "For what?" she demanded, standing slowly, her hands raised but her voice steel. The cop didn't answer, just grabbed her arm, twisting it hard as he shoved her against the wall. She grunted, her cheek pressed to the peeling paint, and caught the glint of a plastic bag in his hand, white powder spilling from its edge. "Found this in your room," he said, his tone dripping with mock surprise. "Cocaine. Looks like you're a dealer now." Her blood ran cold, then hot, fury surging through her veins. "That's not mine," she snapped, her voice cutting through their laughter. "You planted it just like the wallet." The cop tightened his grip, his nails digging into her skin, while another rummaged her bag, tossing her phone and clothes to the floor. "Sure it's not," he taunted, cuffing her wrists with a snap that echoed in the small space. "Tell it to the judge." They dragged her out, the motel's neon sign flickering overhead, its buzz drowned by their jeers. "Thought you were smart, huh?" TV stars going down hard. She kept her head up, her eyes locked forward even as her stomach twisted. Hayes. He'd watched her broadcast, seen her fight back and hit her with this. A drug bust, fabricated, brutal, designed to bury her. They shoved her into a cruiser, the door slamming shut, and she glimpsed him on the newsstand TV as they pulled away. Hayes grinning in a press clip, calling her a drug-addled thug tearing Steelton apart. The precinct loomed ahead, its brick walls a familiar cage, and Aisha sat in the back, her cuffed hands steady despite the storm inside. She'd gone public, thought she'd won a round, but Hayes had flipped it in hours, turning her voice into a noose. The city swayed against her now, her broadcast drowned by his lies, her motel room a staged crime scene. She'd underestimated his reach, his venom, and now she was back where he wanted her, trapped, vilified, her victory ashes like her home. But her eyes glinted in the dark, her SEAL resolve unbroken. He'd raised the stakes and she'd meet them. This wasn't over. If you think Aisha's broadcast was a bold move that deserved better, drop a #1 in the comments. Sick. Save Hayes twisting her every win into a trap. Smash that like button. Want to see her claw her way out of this setup? Subscribe now for the next twist in her fight. How far will Hayes go to silence her, and can she turn his own game against him before it's too late? Aisha Brooks sat in the Steelton precinct's holding cell, the air stale with the tang of rust and despair, her wrists raw from the cuffs that had clamped her hours ago. The motel raid still burned in her mind, cops bursting in, planting cocaine, dragging her back into this concrete box. Officer Victor Hayes had struck again, twisting her public stand into a drug bust that plastered her face across Steelton's news as a criminal. She leaned against the wall, her braided hair catching on the rough cinder block, her dark eyes fixed on the bars. She'd faced traps before, enemy ambushes, rigged IEDs, but this was a different beast, a system stacked against her, and Hayes held the strings. The cell door rattled open at dawn, a guard with a lazy slouch barking her name. "Brooks, court time." She stood, her muscles stiff but her posture unbroken, and followed him out, her boots scuffing the linoleum as they marched her to the courthouse. The halls buzzed with whispers, cops smirking as she passed, their eyes glinting with a glee she recognized from battlefields, men savoring a kill. She kept her head up, her SEAL training a shield against their taunts, her mind racing to piece together a defense. Jamal Pierce, her lawyer, would be there, shaken but fighting. He'd texted her from the diner, promising to unravel Hayes's lies. She had to believe he could. The courtroom loomed, its high ceilings and polished wood a mockery of justice in this rotting city. Aisha took her seat at the defense table, her grey jacket wrinkled from the night in lockup, her hands clasped tight to hide the tremble of exhaustion. Jamal slid in beside her, his sling gone but his arm stiff, his glasses smudged with sweat. He leaned close, his voice a hurried whisper. I dug into Hayes's past, complaints, payoffs, found a lead on the... Judge Clarence Monroe. He's dirty, Aisha. Hayes bribed him for this. His eyes darted to the bench where Monroe entered, his silver hair thinning, his robe hanging loose on a frame worn by years of compromise. Aisha's jaw tightened, her gaze locking on Monroe as he settled in, his face a mask of weary authority. You've got proof? She murmured, her voice low, steady, despite the dread pooling in her gut. Jamal nodded, pulling a thin file from his briefcase. Bank. Records, a witness who saw cash change hands. It's shaky, but it's something. We can challenge this. She gave a curt nod, her hope flickering, fragile, but alive. If Jamal could expose the bribe, they might dismantle this trap. She'd walked free once. She could do it again. The prosecution called Hayes first, his uniform crisp, his boots gleaming as he strode to the stand. He sat with a predator's ease, his blue eyes glinting as he recounted the motel raid. Found her with cocaine, plain as day, he said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. She resisted, yelled threats, same pattern as before. She's a danger to Steelton. The lie rolled off him like water, his smirk faint but sharp, aimed at her across the room. Aisha's fists clenched under the table, her nails digging into her palms, but she kept her face stone, refusing to give him the reaction he craved. Jamal rose for cross-examination, his steps unsteady but his voice firming as he faced Hayes. Officer, your body cam was off during the raid. Convenient, no? Hayes shrugged, his grin widening. Tech fails sometimes. Happens. Jamal pressed, holding up a photo of the cocaine bag. No fingerprints on this, none but yours. How's that possible if she handled it? Hayes didn't flinch. Gloves, maybe. She's crafty. The room murmured, the jury shifting, but Monroe banged his gavel, his eyes narrowing at Jamal. Move on, counselor. Aisha watched, her gut twisting as Jamal faltered, his evidence brushed aside. He tried to introduce the bank records, his voice rising. Your Honor, we have proof of corruption, payments to you from Hayes's account. Monroe's face darkened, his gavel slamming hard. Inadmissible. No chain of custody. Sit down, Pierce. Jamal froze, his papers slipping, and Aisha saw it. The fix was in, deeper than they'd feared. The witness, a nervous clerk who'd seen the bribe, took the stand next, but his story crumbled under the prosecutor's glare, his voice shrinking to a mumble. I might have misremembered. The trial spiraled from there, a slow bleed of hope. Evidence vanished, photos of the raid misplaced, the motel clerk's statement rewritten to damn her. Witnesses lied, 2 cops swearing she'd lunged at them, their tales polished with details Hayes fed them. Aisha testified, her voice cutting through the room, recounting the raid's truth, planted drugs, no resistance, but the jury's eyes, glazed, swayed by Hayes's narrative. Monroe steered it all, his rulings a noose tightening with every objection he overruled. Jamal fought, his passion raw, but he was outmatched, a rookie against a machine oiled with cash and hate. The verdict came fast, too fast, the jury filing back after an hour. Aisha stood, her pulse steady, her training holding her upright as the forewoman, a pinched white woman with cold eyes, read the words. Guilty on all counts, possession, intent to distribute. The room exhaled, a collective breath of relief from Hayes's allies in the gallery, a few claps breaking the silence. Monroe nodded, his voice flat. 5 years, state penitentiary. Sentence begins immediately. His gavel fell, a crack that echoed in her skull, and Aisha felt the air shift, the trap snapping shut. She turned to Jamal, his face pale, his hands shaking as he whispered, I'm sorry. She shook her head, her voice low. Not your fault, we'll appeal. But the words felt hollow as bailiffs grabbed her arms, their grip bruising, hauling her from the table. The gallery parted, faces blurring, some smug, some averted, and she glimpsed Hayes near the door, his arms crossed, his smirk a blade twisting in her gut. He'd won, rigged the game, and now she was caged. They marched her to a transport van, the steel doors slamming as she sat on a bench, her wrists cuffed. Again, the metal cold against her skin. The ride to the penitentiary was a blur of grey roads and barbed wire, Steelton fading behind her. The prison loomed, a squat fortress of concrete and despair, its gates groaning open to swallow her. Inside, they processed her. Fingerprints, mugshot, a jumpsuit that hung loose on her frame, and shoved her into a cell, its walls stained with years of hopelessness. The door clanged shut, the lock clicking, and she stood alone, her breath slow, deliberate, her mind racing. Hours later, footsteps echoed down the hall, and Hayes appeared, his silhouette framed by the bars, his uniform pristine against the prison's. Grime. He leaned close, his breath sour as he spoke. "Told you, Brooks, you're done." His voice dripped with triumph, his eyes glinting with a malice she'd seen in warlords and killers. 5 years'll break you. If it don't, I'll be waiting when you crawl out." He tapped the bars, a mocking rhythm, and grinned. "Enjoy the cage, hero." Aisha didn't move, her gaze locked on him, her face a mask of calm that hid the fire roaring inside. He lingered, savoring her silence, then turned and walked away, his boots fading into the hum of the cell block. She sank onto the bunk, the springs groaning, her hands resting on her knees. 5 years, a lifetime in a place like this, designed to crush spirits like hers. Hayes had bribed Monroe, turned the court into his weapon, and buried her under lies thicker than the cocaine he'd planted. The broadcast, her stand, had backfired, giving him the excuse to hit harder, to lock her away where no one would hear. But she wasn't broken, not yet. She'd survived worse, months in enemy territory, wounds that should have killed her, and she'd outlasted them all. Hayes didn't know that. He saw a black woman he could crush, not a seal who'd crawled through hell and come out steel. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the ceiling, its cracks a map of her next moves. She'd appeal, yes, but that wasn't enough. She'd find a way out, turn this cage into a weapon, and come for him. The trial was his trap, but she'd make it his grave. Her fingers traced the bunk's edge, her resolve hardening like a blade in the forge. He'd gloat now, but she'd be back, and he'd pay. Aisha Brooks lay on the prison bunk, the thin mattress sagging under her weight, the cell's damp air clinging to her skin like a second skin. Steelton State Penitentiary was a fortress of despair, its grey walls stained with decades of broken lives, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. She'd been here 3 days, locked away on Officer Victor Hayes's rigged drug charge, the 5-year sentence a noose he'd tightened with a bribed judge and planted cocaine. Her jumpsuit scratched at her shoulders, her braided hair matted from restless nights, but her dark eyes gleamed with a fire no cage could snuff out. Hayes had gloated through the bars, his smug "you're done" echoing in her skull, but he didn't know her, not really. She was a Navy SEAL, retired but unbroken, and she'd faced worse than this: enemy camps, kill zones, odds that should have buried her. She'd get out. She had to. The cell block hummed with the low drone of inmates, coughs, murmurs, the clank of metal, but Aisha tuned it out, her mind a battlefield of plans. Appealing the verdict was a long shot. Judge Monroe's corruption ran deep, and Hayes's reach stretched beyond Steelton's rusting streets. She couldn't wait for courts to crawl. She'd break free, use her training to slip this trap, and turn the fight back on him. Her fingers traced the bunk's rusted frame, feeling for weaknesses, her SEAL instincts mapping every inch of her 6x8 prison. The lock was old, a pin and tumbler she could pick with the right tool. The guards were lazy, their patrols predictable. Every 30 minutes passed her cell. She'd watched them, clocked their steps, their yawns. Tonight a storm was rolling in, the kind that had masked noise and chaos. It was her window. She'd scavenged what she could, a bent spoon from the mess hall, its edge sharpened against the concrete floor, a strip of wire pried from the bunk's underside, thin but sturdy. She hid them in her sleeve, her hands steady as she waited for dusk. the sky beyond the barred window darkening with clouds. Thunder rumbled, a low growl that vibrated through the walls, and rain began to slap the glass, a steady drumbeat that quickened her pulse. The guards shuffled past at 7, their boots squelching on wet tiles, their chatter drowned by the storm. She moved then, silent and swift, sliding to the door and working the wire into the lock. Her fingers danced, muscle memory from covert, ops kicking in, twisting, probing, until the tumblers clicked. The spoon wedged in next, a lever to force the bolt, and the lock gave with a soft snap, swallowed by a thunderclap. Aisha eased the door open, her breath shallow, her body low, as she slipped into the hall. The cell block stretched before her, a dim tunnel of steel and shadow, the storm's roar her cloak. She crept past snoring inmates, their forms slumped on bunks, and hugged the wall as a guard's flashlight bobbed at the far end. She ducked into an alcove, a rusted pipe dripping beside her, and held still, her heart a steady drum against her ribs. The guard passed, muttering about the rain, his beam missing her by inches. She exhaled, then moved again, her boots silent on the slick floor, heading for the laundry chute she'd scoped on day 1. A narrow shaft to the basement, unguarded, a relic of the prison's old design. She reached it, a metal hatch bolted, loose, and pried it open with the spoon, the hinges groaning faintly under the storm's cover. She slid in feet first, the chute's walls cold and tight, scraping her elbows as she dropped 10 feet into a pile of damp towels. The basement stank, of bleach and mildew, its concrete floor slick with puddles, but she landed soft, rolling to her feet. A service door loomed ahead, its lock rusted, and she worked it with the wire, her hands steady despite the adrenaline spiking her veins. It gave, and she stepped into the rain-soaked night, the prison's outer yard a blur of mud and wire under. Flashing lightning. Aisha ran, her jumpsuit plastered to her skin, the storm a shield as she scaled a low fence, her fingers gripping wet metal, her muscles screaming but holding. She dropped to the other side, Steelton's rain-slicked streets sprawling before her, freedom a sharp taste on her tongue. She'd done it, slipped Hayes's cage, turned his victory to dust. Her chest swelled, a fleeting rush of triumph as she sprinted toward an abandoned lot, her boots splashing through puddles, her mind racing to the next step. She'd hide, find Jamal, and strike back. She'd won this round, outsmarted him with nothing but a spoon and wire, her seal grit shining through the dark. But the night shattered with sirens, a wail cutting through the rain like a blade. She froze, her breath clouding in the cold, her eyes darting to the prison's silhouette as lights flared, red and blue pulsing through the storm. Hayes, he'd been alerted. Someone had snitched or the guards had checked early. She cursed under her breath, ducking behind a rusted dumpster as cruisers roared onto the streets, their tires screeching, their beams slicing the dark. She'd tasted victory for minutes, and now it was gone, replaced by a manhunt she hadn't planned for. Her pulse hammered, her body low as she peered out, spotting Hayes's cruiser leading the pack, his silhouette rigid in the driver's seat. He leaned out, megaphone in hand, his voice crackling over the rain. Aisha Brooks, armed and dangerous, shoot on sight. The lie was bold, vicious, painting her as a killer to justify the hunt. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their spotlights sweeping the lot, pinning her shadow against the wall. She bolted, her legs pumping, her training driving her toward a drainage ditch 50 yards off. Bullets cracked behind her, pinging off metal, the cops firing wild into the night. She dove into the ditch, mud swallowing her knees, the water icy as it soaked her through. She crawled, her breath ragged, the choppers roared deafening as their lights danced above. Aisha reached a culvert, its mouth a black maw, and squeezed inside, her shoulders scraping concrete, her body trembling from cold and strain. She pressed against the wall, the storm's rumble masking her gasps, her eyes tracking the lights outside. Hayes's voice echoed again, closer now, barking orders to his men. Fan out, she's here somewhere. He was relentless, his fury a whip cracking over Steelton, turning the city into his hunting ground. She'd escaped, thought she'd won, but he'd flipped it in an instant, his power flexing wider, deadlier than she'd imagined. The ditch water lapped at her chest, her teeth chattering but her mind stayed sharp, plotting her next move. She'd made it out, a feat most couldn't dream of, her seal skills bending steel and storm to her will. But freedom was a ghost, slipping through her fingers as Hayes unleashed hell. She'd underestimated his desperation, his need to crush her, and now she was prey in a city he owned. The culvert was a lifeline, a pause to breathe, but she couldn't stay. She'd head west toward the river, lose them in the sprawl of warehouses and shadows. Her hands gripped the wire, still tucked in her sleeve, a talisman of her breakout, and her resolve hardened. She'd escaped his cage, but the war was just starting. The choppers circled, their beams relentless, and Hayes's cruiser prowled the streets, his voice a taunt she couldn't shake. She'd tasted victory, brief and bitter, only to see it morph into a nightmare worse than the cell. 5 years behind bars had become a death sentence on the run, his shoot-on-sight order a noose tightening with every step. She slid deeper into the culvert, her body aching, her spirit unbowed. He'd hunt her, but she'd hunt him back, turn his game into her battlefield. The storm raged on, her ally and her enemy, as she vanished into the dark, a shadow he couldn't catch, yet think Aisha's escape proves she's tougher than Hayes can handle. Drop a number 1 in the comments. Furious at his lies turning her breakout into a death trap? Hit that like button. Ready to see her outrun his manhunt and strike back? Subscribe now for the next chapter of her fight. What's Hayes got up his sleeve to top a citywide hunt? And can Aisha stay one step ahead before he closes in? Aisha Brooks crouched in the culvert, the icy water soaking her prison jumpsuit, her breath fogging in the damp air as Steelton's manhunt roared above. The storm had masked her escape from the penitentiary, her seal skills bending locks and shadows to her will. But Officer Victor Hayes had turned her fleeting victory into a death sentence. Helicopters thumped overhead, their spotlights slashing through the rain, while his shoot-on-sight order echoed in her ears, a lie branding her a killer. She'd slipped their net, crawled through mud and darkness, but freedom was a fragile thread, and she knew Hayes wouldn't rest until it snapped. She gripped the wire from her breakout, its sharp edge a lifeline in her sleeve, and slid out of the culvert, her boots sinking into the ditch's slime as she plotted her next move. The river lay west, its warehouses a maze where she could vanish, so she ran, her body low, the rain a curtain shielding her from the chopper's glare. Her muscles burned, her lungs ached, but she pushed through, her training a drumbeat in her veins, survive, adapt, overcome. Steelton's streets blurred past, slick with puddles reflecting red and blue lights, the sirens a wail she couldn't shake. She reached an industrial sprawl, its rusted hulks of factories and silos looming like ghosts, and ducked into an abandoned textile mill, its broken windows gaping like eyes. The air inside was thick with dust and mold, the floor littered with shattered looms and tangled thread, but it was shelter, a pause to breathe. She leaned against a crumbling wall, her chest heaving, her mind racing. She'd made it this far, out of the cell past the hunt, and thought she'd bought time to regroup. Aisha peeled off the sodden jumpsuit, shivering as the cold bit her skin, and scavenged a tattered tarp from a corner, wrapping it around her shoulders like a cloak. Her braided hair dripped, her hands trembled, but her eyes stayed sharp, scanning the dark for threats. She'd hide here until dawn, then find Jamal, her lawyer, and turn this chaos back on Hayes. The mill's silence was a balm, its shadows a shield, and she sank onto a pile of rotting fabric, her body screaming for rest. She'd outsmarted them, slipped a noose tighter than any she'd faced in combat. Her lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, victory, small but hers, when a creak snapped her upright, her senses flaring like a tripped wire. Footsteps thudded outside, heavy and deliberate, circling the mill's perimeter. She crouched low, her tarp rustling faintly, her heart pounding as voices cut through the rain's drone. "She's here," one growled, low and rough, not a cop's clipped tone, but something uglier, personal. Another laughed, a jagged sound that sent ice down her spine. "Let's finish her." Aisha's gut twisted. Hayes's crew, off duty, unleashed like dogs. She'd thought she'd dodged him, but he'd sent his pack, men who didn't need badges to hunt. She edged toward a shattered window, peering out, and saw them, 5 figures in dark jackets, their faces obscured by hoods, bats and pipes glinting. In their hands under a flickering streetlight, they kicked the mill's door in, wood splintering, and stormed inside, their boots crunching glass as they spread out. Aisha moved, silent as a shadow, slipping behind a rusted loom, her breath held. Tight. The leader, a hulking man with a shaved head and a scar across his jaw, swung his bat against a wall, the crack echoing. "Come out, Brooks," he sneered, his voice thick with hate. "You don't belong here. Never did." The others fanned. Out, their taunts overlapping, racial slurs, venom she'd heard too often, now sharpened with intent. "Hayes says you're done," one spat, a wiry guy with a crooked nose, smashing a pipe against a beam. "Time to learn your place." Aisha's fists clenched, her SEAL training surging, assess, evade, strike. But she was cornered, outnumbered, unarmed. She darted to a stairwell, her tarp snagging on a nail, and climbed, her boots soft on the rotting steps. The mill's second floor stretched wide, a graveyard of machinery and cobwebs, and she ducked behind a loom, her pulse a war drum. They followed, their steps thundering below, their voices rising. "She's up there!" the scarred leader charged. The stairs, his bat raised, and Aisha braced herself, her mind racing for an out. She'd slipped the prison, the hunt, thought she'd won, until now. They found her, a flashlight beam pinning her against the loom, and she bolted, her legs pumping as she wove through the maze of steel and rust. The scarred man lunged, his bat swinging, missing her by inches as she dove under a conveyor belt. She rolled to her feet, her tarp lost, her body exposed in the damp undershirt and shorts from the prison. The wiry one cut her off, his pipe crashing down, and she dodged, the metal grazing her arm, drawing blood. Pain flared, but she gritted her teeth, her training overriding it. She grabbed a loose bolt from the floor, hurling it at his face, and he staggered, cursing as blood streamed from his nose. But they closed in, a pack tightening their circle, and the scarred leader tackled her, his weight slamming her to the ground. Her head cracked against concrete, stars bursting in her vision, and the others piled on, their bats raining down. Wood and metal met flesh, bruising her ribs, splitting her lip, the blows a storm of hate she couldn't block. "You don't belong here," the leader snarled, his breath hot on her face as he pinned her, his bat pressing her throat. "Hayes owns this town, not you." She gasped, her lungs burning, her arms flailing as the wiry one kicked her side, a rib cracking with a sickening snap. Aisha fought, her nails clawing at the leader's arm, her legs kicking, but they were relentless, their slurs a chorus. Worthless, an outsider, a trash. Each word a lash as brutal as their blows. Blood pooled in her mouth, her vision blurring, but her spirit roared, refusing to break. She'd faced death in deserts. Jungles stared it down and won, but this was different, personal, raw, a hatred she couldn't outrun. The scarred man raised his bat for a final strike, his eyes glinting with triumph when a phone buzzed, sharp and insistent, cutting through their frenzy. He froze, pulling a burner from his pocket, and answered, his voice low. "Yeah, boss." A pause, then a grin. "She's down. Bad." Hayes's voice crackled through, faint but venomous. "Good. Next time you finish her." The leader smirked, pocketing the phone, and leaned close, his bat tapping her cheek. "Hayes says you're lucky tonight. Next time you're dead." He stood, signaling the others, and they backed off, their laughter echoing as they melted into the dark, leaving her sprawled in the mill's wreckage. Aisha lay there, blood dripping from her mouth, her body a map of pain, ribs cracked, arm gashed, head throbbing. The rain pounded the roof, a relentless drum, and she coughed, her breath ragged, her vision swimming. She'd escaped the prison, thought she'd outsmarted Hayes, but he'd hit back harder, his off-duty mob a blade sharper than any bullet. Her tarp lay crumpled nearby, her wire lost in the fight, and she crawled toward it, her hands shaking as she pulled it over her shoulders. Every move was agony, her ribs screaming, but she forced herself up, leaning against the loom, her blood staining its rust. The mill was silent again, the storm her only companion, and she staggered to a window, peering out at Steelton's rain-soaked sprawl. Hayes's crew had vanished, their attack a message, She wasn't safe, not here, not anywhere he could reach. She'd tasted freedom, thought she'd turned the tables, but he'd flipped it again. His power a net she couldn't escape. Her chest heaved, her fury a coal glowing through the pain. He'd sent men to break her, not cops but vigilantes, cowards hiding behind his badge. She spat blood onto the floor, her eyes narrowing as she steadied herself. They'd left her alive, a mistake she'd make them regret. Aisha stumbled down the stairs, her body protesting, and slipped into the night, the rain washing blood from her face as she limped toward the river. She'd hide, heal, and come back stronger. Hayes didn't know the fire he'd lit. She'd thought she'd won escaping, but this was war now, and she'd fight it her way. The city loomed, a beast waiting to swallow her, but she was a seal. Forged in worse, and she'd claw her way out. Hayes had raised the stakes, and she'd meet them, battered but unbowed. Aisha Brooks staggered through Steelton's rain-soaked streets, her body a canvas of bruises and blood. The tarp draped over her shoulders, a tattered shield against the storm. Officer Victor Hayes's off-duty mob had beaten her near death in the abandoned mill, their bats and pipes cracking her ribs, splitting her lip, leaving her sprawled in the dust with his voice taunting through a burner phone. "Next time, you're dead." She'd escaped prison, slipped his manhunt, thought she'd carved a sliver of control only to be ambushed by his hate-fueled pack. Pain seared her side with every step, her breath a shallow rasp, but her seal resolve burned brighter than the agony. She wouldn't break, not for him, not for this city. And she limped toward the river, her boots splashing through puddles, her mind fixed on survival. The storm faded as dawn crept over the skyline, its grey light glinting off the water, where warehouses slumped like forgotten giants. Aisha reached a black neighborhood on the west side, its row houses weathered but alive with the hum of early risers. Kids laughing, radios crackling, the smell of frying bacon drifting from open windows. She'd avoided this area since moving to Steelton, keeping her distance to avoid trouble, but now she had nowhere else to go. Her tarp slipped as she stumbled onto a stoop, her knees buckling, and she caught herself against the door, blood smearing the wood from her gashed arm. A woman's voice called out, sharp with alarm, "Who's there?" The door swung open, revealing a stout woman in her 50s, her graying hair pulled tight, her brown eyes narrowing at Aisha's battered form. "Lord, child, what happened? To you?" she asked, her tone shifting from suspicion to concern as she stepped aside. Aisha tried to speak, her voice a croak, and the woman, Miss Clara, she'd later learn, grabbed her arm, guiding her in. "Sit before you fall," Clara ordered, easing her onto a floral couch that sagged under her weight. The room was warm, cluttered with photos of smiling kids and a cross-stitched Bible verse on the wall, a stark contrast to the mill's cold. Ruin. Aisha sank back, her tarp pooling around her, her breath steadying as Clara fetched a wet cloth and pressed it to her split lip. "Cops did this?" Clara asked, her voice low, knowing. Aisha nodded, wincing as the cloth stung. "Hayes. Framed me, locked me up, sent his boys after I broke out." Clara's jaw tightened, her hands pausing. "Victor Hayes. That snake's been terrorizing us for years, stops beatings, lies. You're the one from the news, ain't you, the TV lady?" Aisha's eyes flicked up, meeting hers, and she nodded again. "Yeah, thought I could fight him. Got this instead." Clara didn't flinch, just cleaned the blood from Aisha's face with a gentleness that belied her steel. "You fought. That's more than most. Folks here will listen. Hayes crossed a line with you," she stood, her voice firm. "Rest, I'll get word out." Aisha wanted to protest, but her body betrayed her, exhaustion pulling her under as Clara draped a blanket. Over her, the room fading to black. She woke hours later, the sun high, voices buzzing outside. Clara had spread her story. Neighbors gathered on the stoop, their faces a mix of anger and awe as they peered in. A young man with dreads, Tyrell, stepped inside, his fists clenched. "Heard what Hayes did. Burned your place, framed you. Now this, we're done taking it." An older woman, Miss Evelyn, nodded, her cane tapping the floor. "My boy got hassled by him last month. Planted weed, took him 6 weeks to get clear. You're one of us now." Aisha sat up, pain stabbing her ribs, but their fire lit something in her, a spark she hadn't felt since her SEAL days. By noon, The streets swelled with people, dozens spilling from houses, their voices rising as Tyrell and Clara rallied them. Aisha stood, her tarp swapped for a borrowed jacket, her bruises stark under the sunlight, and faced the crowd. "Hayes wants me gone," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, cutting through the murmurs. "Burned my home, locked me up, sent men to kill me. I'm not running, I'm fighting, for me, for you, for everyone he's crushed." She paused, her dark eyes sweeping the faces. Tired mothers, angry teens, grey-haired men with scars of their own. "Stand with me." They did. Signs sprouted. "Justice for Aisha, down with Hayes," scribbled on cardboard, held high as the crowd marched toward the riverfront, their chants echoing off brick walls. No more lies. No more fear. Aisha walked at the front, her limp masked. By grit, her presence a beacon. Kids ran alongside, one, a girl with pigtails named Lila, grabbing her hand, her smile bright despite the weight of it all. Steelton watched, windows cracking open, phones filming, the rally swelling to 100 strong. Aisha's chest swelled. She'd inspired this, turned her pain into power, a victory Hayes couldn't touch. The news vans rolled in, cameras flashing. And she felt the tide shift, her story spreading beyond his grip. They reached a park by the river, its grass patchy but alive, and the crowd circled her, their voices a roar. Tyrell hoisted a megaphone, shouting, "Hayes can't stop us!" Aisha took it, her words raw. "He thinks he owns this city, but..." "And we do, we're done bowing." Cheers erupted, fists pumping, and she handed the megaphone back, stepping to Lila, who hugged her tight. "You're strong," the girl whispered, and Aisha's throat tightened, a rare crack in her armor. She'd won this moment, Hayes's shadow retreating under their light. Then the world exploded. A deafening boom ripped through the park, the ground shaking as a pipe bomb detonated near the crowd's edge, shrapnel tearing through flesh and air. Screams replaced cheers, bodies falling, blood pooling on the grass. Aisha dove, shielding Lila as metal rained, her ears ringing, her ribs screaming from the impact. Smoke choked the sky, thick and acrid, and she rolled off the girl, her hands checking for wounds. Lila was alive, sobbing, her arm gashed, but breathing. Aisha staggered up, her vision swimming, and saw the carnage, 5 dead, their bodies twisted, a child among them, his small frame still where she'd laughed with him minutes ago. Panic seized the crowd, people fleeing, their unity shattered by the blast. Aisha's knees buckled, grief clawing her chest as she cradled the dead boy, his blood soaking her hands, his name, Malik, whispered by a fleeing mother. She'd held him, promised him hope, and now he was gone. Sirens wailed, news vans spinning, the chaos, and she knew, Hayes, his crew, his bomb, his revenge for her rally. She'd inspired them, thought she'd won, and he'd hit back with a brutality that dwarfed the mill beating, a massacre to break their spirit. Cops swarmed in, their faces grim, but Aisha saw Hayes on a TV screen across the street, his voice booming through a live feed. "This is her chaos, Aisha Brooks, a fugitive stirring violence. We'll stop her." The lie was swift, vicious, pinning the bomb on her, turning Steelton against her in a heartbeat. The crowd's remnants stared, their eyes shifting from awe to fear, whispers of "she did this" rippling through. Aisha stood, blood dripping from her hands, her victory ashes once more. Hayes had flipped it, his power a sledgehammer smashing. Her stand, her people, her hope. She backed away, Tyrell grabbing her arm, his voice urgent. "We gotta go, he'll pin it all on you." She nodded, numb, and they slipped into an alley, the sirens fading as the river loomed. Her body ached, her soul heavier, the boy's blood a stain she couldn't wash off. She'd rallied them, thought she'd struck a blow, but Hayes had answered with death, his reach of venom she couldn't outrun. Her seal grit held, but barely, her eyes glinting with a fury born of loss. He'd taken lives to bury her, and she'd make him pay. Think Aisha's rally showed Steelton's real strength only for Hayes to crush it? Drop a #1 in the comments. Outraged he'd bomb his own city to frame her. Hit that like button. Need to see her rise from this tragedy. Subscribe now for her next move. How deep will Hayes sink to keep her down? And can Aisha turn this loss into a weapon before he strikes again? Aisha Brooks stumbled through Steelton's alleys, her boots dragging through puddles, her borrowed jacket soaked with rain and blood from the rally's bombing. Tyrell's hand gripped her arm, steadying her as they fled the park where Officer Victor Hayes's pipe bomb had ripped through her stand, killing 5, including a child whose lifeless body still haunted her. Malik, his name a wound in her chest. The city's west side blurred past, its row houses silent now, their windows dark as the community she'd rallied turned from her, swayed by Hayes's TV lie blaming her for the blast. Her ribs throbbed, her arm bled from the mill beating, but her SEAL resolve held her upright, a steel core forged through decades of war. She'd thought she'd won their trust, only to see it shatter in a cloud of shrapnel and screams. Tyrell pulled her into a basement, a cramped space beneath his aunt's house, its walls lined with canned goods and old quilts. The air was thick, with mildew, the single bulb flickering as he locked the door. "You're safe here," he said, his dreads falling over his eyes, his voice tight with fear and fury. "Hayes pinned that bomb on you. Cops are everywhere, calling you a terrorist." Aisha sank onto a crate, her breath shallow, her hands trembling as she wiped Malik's blood from her fingers. "He's not done," she rasped, her voice raw. "He'll keep coming until I'm gone, or he is." She leaned back, her head against the damp concrete, her mind racing. The rally had been her strike, a flare to light Hayes's corruption, but he'd doused it with death, turning Steelton against her. She needed help. Jamal Pierce, her lawyer, was her only link now, shaken but still fighting. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket. Its screen cracked from the mill fight and dialed him, her fingers steady despite the pain. He answered on the third ring, his voice a whisper. "Aisha, where are you? The news, they're saying you bombed the park." "It's Hayes," she cut in, her tone sharp. "He planted it, killed them to frame me. I need you to do something big. Now." Jamal hesitated, his breath hitching. "What?" She closed her eyes, the weight of her next words settling like stone. "Leak my record. Navy SEAL Lieutenant Commander retired. Everything. Get it to the press, the feds, anyone who will listen. They need to know who I am." Silence stretched. Then he exhaled. "That's your ace? Okay, I've got a contact at WSTN. Give me an hour." She hung up, pocketing the phone, and glanced at Tyrell, who stared, his mouth open. "SEAL?" he asked, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. She nodded, her jaw tight. 20 years. Classified ops, combat zones. Hayes doesn't know. He thinks I'm just a target. Tyrell's eyes widened, a flicker of hope breaking through his grief. "That changes everything. They can't ignore that." Aisha didn't reply, her gaze distant. It was a gamble, her past a weapon she'd kept sheathed, but Hayes had pushed her too far, burned her home, locked her up, beaten her, bombed her people. She'd show Steelton the truth. An hour later, the basement's silence broke as Tyrell's radio crackled, WSTN's broadcast cutting through static. "Breaking news," the anchor's voice boomed, tense with shock. "Aisha Brooks, fugitive in the park bombing, confirmed as a retired Navy SEAL, Lieutenant Commander with 2 decades of service. Documents leaked to us detail commendations, covert missions, heroism beyond question." Aisha stood, her ribs protesting, and Tyrell turned up the volume, his breath catching. The anchor continued. "Steelton PD claims she's a traitor, but these records paint a different picture. Who is Aisha Brooks really?" The city erupted. Phones buzzed, TVs flared, social media flooded with her mugshot beside grainy photos of her in uniform, medals pinned to her chest. Steelton gasped, its streets alive with whispers, some in awe, others in doubt. Aisha stepped outside, her jacket hiding her wounds, and saw it in the faces peering from windows. Curiosity, respect, a crack in Hayes's lies. She stood taller, her limp fading, her presence a challenge to his narrative. She'd won this round, her identity a spotlight burning through his terrorist smear. The feds would have to look now, the press too. She wasn't just a fugitive, she was a hero they couldn't ignore. But victory soured fast. Hours later, as dusk settled, Hayes hit back, his counterstrike a venomous twist she hadn't seen coming. The same WSTN broadcast flickered on a corner store TV as she passed, the anchor's voice now grim. New evidence from Steelton PD. Documents alleging Brooks sold military secrets during her service. A traitor hiding behind her SEAL record. Officer Victor Hayes claims she's a national security threat, calling for federal intervention. Aisha froze, her blood running cold, her eyes locked on the screen as Hayes appeared, his uniform crisp, his smirk a blade. "She's no hero," he said, his voice smooth, lethal. "She betrayed this country, and now she's tearing Steelton apart. We'll bring her in." The street shifted, heads turning, eyes narrowing. Neighbors who'd cheered her rally now stepped back, their trust fracturing. A man spat on the sidewalk, muttering, "Traitor!" A woman pulled her kid inside, slamming the door. Aisha's chest tightened, her hands clenching as Tyrell caught up, his face pale. "He faked it," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "Those papers, bullshit, right?" She nodded, her voice a growl. "Forged. He's burying me deeper." Her SEAL record, her pride, twisted into a lie. Hayes had taken her truth and poisoned it, his reach a web she couldn't cut. Sirens wailed, closer now, and Tyrell tugged her toward an alley. "Feds will be here soon. He's got them chasing you too." She ran, her body screaming, her mind reeling as helicopters buzzed overhead, their spotlights sweeping the west side. Steelton's air thickened with his lie, her mugshot now aha. Traitor's face on every screen, her heroism erased by forged papers only Hayes could have planted. She'd stood tall, thought she'd flipped the board, but he'd turned her past against her, his revenge a stroke that dwarfed the bomb. The feds weren't coming to help. They were hunting her, his national security threat tag, a noose tightening with every step. They ducked into a warehouse, its steel walls echoing with rain, and Aisha leaned against a crate, her breath ragged, her blood staining the floor from her reopened gash. Tyrell paced, his fists balled. "How's he doing this? He's one cop!" Aisha's eyes narrowed, her voice low, steady despite the storm inside. "He's not just a cop, he's a machine, got the system in his pocket. Judge cops, now this." She'd exposed herself, thought it'd shield her, but Hayes had spun it faster, deadlier. A masterstroke that made the mill beating and park bombing feel like warnings. Her SEAL past was her rock, 20 years of missions, rescuing. Hostages, toppling warlords, now a weapon in his hands. She'd walked free from deserts and jungles, but Steelton was a battlefield she couldn't map, its rules bent by his hate. The warehouse's shadows swallowed her, her body aching, her spirit dented but uncrushed. She'd won a moment, seen. Steelton's eyes widen at her truth, only to lose it to his lie. Her fingers traced the crate's edge, her resolve hardening like a blade in the dark. He'd raised the stakes to a national hunt, but she'd fought bigger odds, alone, outnumbered, outgunned, and survived. Aisha stood, her limp pronounced but her gaze fierce, and turned to Tyrell. "We move tonight. Find Jamal. Get proof. Those papers are fake." He nodded, his jaw tight, and they slipped out, the city a beast roaring with sirens and lies. Hayes had flipped her victory into a nightmare, his traitor label a chain she'd break. She'd thought she'd struck deep, but he'd cut deeper, and now the feds were his pawns. Her war wasn't just Steelton's anymore. It was hers, personal, and she'd fight it to the end, battered but alive. Aisha Brooks slipped through Steelton's shadows, her borrowed jacket heavy with rain, her body a tapestry of pain from the mill beating and the rally's bombing. Tyrell stayed close, his dreads damp, his breath quick as they moved from the warehouse toward the riverfront, the city's industrial spine a maze of rust and steel. Officer Victor Hayes had turned her SEAL revelation into a traitor's lie, forging papers that branded her a national security threat, unleashing feds and cops in a manhunt that buzzed overhead with choppers and sirens. She'd thought exposing her past would shield her, but he'd flipped it, his venom sinking deeper than the bomb that killed 5. Now she needed Jamal Pierce, her lawyer, her last link, to prove those documents fake and turn this war back on Hayes. They reached a derelict warehouse by the river, its walls sagging under decades of neglect, its windows shattered like broken teeth. Aisha had scouted it days ago, a fallback from her escape, its isolation perfect for a trap. She'd lure Hayes here, use her SEAL tactics to corner him and force a confession. Recorded, undeniable, a blade to cut his lies. Her burner phone buzzed, Jamal's voice crackling through. Got a guy at WSTN who will air it live if we get proof. Where are you? She gave him the coordinates, her voice low. Bring a camera. Stay hidden. It's tonight. He hesitated, then agreed, his resolve shaky but holding. Aisha rigged the warehouse, her hands steady despite the ache in her ribs, her training a lifeline in the dark. She strung wire from her prison breakout across doorways, tripwires to slow him, and hid a rusted pipe behind a crate, her weapon crude but lethal. Tyrell watched, his eyes wide. You sure he'll come? She nodded, her jaw tight. He's obsessed. Won't trust his crew after the bomb. I'll make him. She sent a text from the burner to a precinct tip line, cryptic but baited. Brooks at River Warehouse. Calm alone. Hayes's ego would drag him here. His need to finish her personal raw night fell. The rivers murmur a low hum under the city's distant roar, and Aisha waited, crouched behind a stack of rotting pallets, her breath slow, her senses razor sharp. Tyrell hid outside, a lookout with orders to run if it went south. Headlights cut the dark, a cruiser rolling up, its engine growling as it stopped. Hayes stepped out, his uniform crisp, his blue eyes glinting with a fury she'd seen in killers half a world away. He carried a flashlight and his service pistol, his boots crunching gravel as he entered alone, his arrogance a beacon she'd banked on. She let him stalk deeper, his beam sweeping the shadows, his voice a taunt. Brooks, I know you're here. Hiding like a rat won't save you. She shifted, silent, and triggered a wire, a clatter echoing as a can fell. He spun, his pistol raised, and she moved, circling behind him, her pipe gripped tight. He stepped into her trap, another wire snagging his ankle, and she struck, the pipe cracking his wrist, his gun skittering across the floor. He roared, lunging, but she dodged, her training a dance, swift, precise, lethal. She pinned him against a crate, her arm locking his throat, the pipe pressing his chest. You're done, Hayes, she hissed, her voice steel. Confess everything. He laughed, a guttural sound that chilled her, his breath sour as he choked out. You think this ends me? She pulled a recorder from her pocket, its red light blinking, and shoved it near his face. Talk, the wallet, the fire, the bomb, the papers, all of it. His eyes narrowed, but he spoke, his voice dripping venom. Yeah, I planted the wallet, burned your shack, bombed your little rally. 5 dead. Too bad it wasn't more. The traitor bit. Forged it. You're nothing, Brooks, a stain I'll wipe out. She held him, her grip iron, her heart pounding with a victory she could taste. His words caught, her ticket to turn Steelton against him. Isha eased the pipe, stepping back, the recorder in hand, her eyes locked on his smirk. She'd won. He'd confessed, his empire cracking under his own voice. She'd send it to Jamal, let WSTN blast it live, and watch him fall. You're finished, she said, her voice steady, her SEAL grit shining through the pain. Hayes slumped, his wrist limp, his flashlight rolling across the floor, and she turned to signal Tyrell, her chest swelling with a triumph she hadn't felt since breaking out. Then a gunshot shattered the air, a sharp crack from the warehouse's far end, and Aisha spun, her instincts flaring too late. Her brother Malik, named like the boy from the rally, a cruel echo, burst through a side door, his face frantic, his voice a shout. Aisha, I found you! He'd tracked her from Harrisburg, Marcus tipping him off, his loyalty dragging him into Steelton's jaws. Before she could yell, a second shot rang out, and Malik crumpled, blood blooming on his chest, his eyes wide as he hit the ground. A sniper, Hayes's shadow perched in the rafters, his rifle glinting under a broken skylight. Aisha screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore from her core, and dropped beside Malik, her hands pressing his wound, blood seeping through her fingers, hot and slick. No, stay with me, she begged, her voice breaking. Her SEAL calm shattered as his breath rattled, his dark eyes fading. Hayes laughed, staggering up, his wrist dangling but his glee unbroken. Told you, Brooks, next time's death. Guess he took it for you. He signaled the sniper, who vanished and limped out, his cackle echoing as Malik's pulse stopped, his hand slack in hers. She rocked over him, her brother's blood pooling, her recorder forgotten on the floor, its red light still blinking. She'd trapped Hayes, got his confession, thought she'd won. Her biggest strike yet, a blow to topple him, and he'd flipped it with a bullet. His revenge, a wound deeper than the mill's bats or the bomb's shrapnel. Malik, 35, a mechanic who'd begged her to leave Steelton, now dead because he'd come for her. Her chest heaved, sobs choking her as she clutched him. His warmth fading, her victory drowned in loss. The warehouse stood silent, the river's hum a cruel backdrop as she knelt in his blood, her hands trembling, her mind a storm of grief and rage. She'd outsmarted Hayes, turned his game against him, but he'd struck her heart, his sniper a blade she hadn't seen. Her SEAL training held her together, barely, her eyes glinting through tears as she stood, lifting Malik's body. His weight a burden she'd carry forever. She'd won the confession, a weapon to bury him but at a cost that broke her. Her brother, her rock, gone in a flash of gunpowder and hate. Aisha stumbled out, Malik in her arms, the recorder in her pocket, her boots dragging through the gravel as she headed for Tyrell. Hayes had escaped, his sniper covering his retreat, his laughter a taunt she'd never unhear. She'd thought she'd cornered him, ended his reign, but he'd raised the stakes, personal and brutal, a kill that dwarfed his earlier strikes. The night swallowed her, her limp pronounced, her spirit dented but burning. She'd send the recording, let it rip him apart, but it wouldn't bring Malik back. Her war was hers alone now, a vow sealed in blood. She'd fight until Hayes fell, no matter the cost. She reached the alley where Tyrell waited, his gasp sharp as he saw Malik, his hands shaking as he helped her lay him down. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice hollow, her eyes locked on her brother's still face. The recorder weighed heavy, her victory a pyre, and she handed it to Tyrell, her voice steel through the grief. "Get it to Jamal, now." He nodded, tears streaking his face, and ran. The tape, her last strike in a battle that cost her everything. Hayes had flipped her win into a nightmare, but she'd rise from this, a SEAL unbroken, her fury a flame he'd never extinguish. Aisha Brooks stood in the alley, her brother Malik's blood drying on her hands. His body limp beside her as Tyrell clutched the recorder with Officer Victor Hayes' confession and sprinted into Steelton's night. The warehouse showdown had been her strike, Hayes pinned, his voice damning him for the wallet, the fire, the bomb, the forged traitor papers, until his sniper's bullet stole Malik, flipping her victory into a wound that bled deeper than the mill's beating or the rally's blast. Her ribs ached, her arm oozed from reopened gashes, but her SEAL resolve burned through the grief, a coal glowing in her chest. She'd lost everything, her home, her brother, her name, but the tape was her weapon, a truth to bury Hayes, and she'd wield it, no matter the cost. She lifted Malik's body, his weight a silent vow, and staggered toward the riverfront, her boots dragging through gravel, her breath a rasp in the cold air. The city loomed, its rusted skyline a beast she'd fought to tame, and she headed for a payphone near the docks, its glass cracked but glowing under a flickering streetlight. She dialed Jamal Pierce, her lawyer, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Tyrell's got the tape," Hayes confessed. "Get it on air now." Jamal's breath hitched, his words tumbling fast. "WSTN's ready. I'll meet him." "Push it live, where are you?" She didn't answer, just hung up, her eyes locked on Malik's still face as she laid him in the shadows, a promise to bury him proper when this was done. Minutes stretched into an hour, her body slumped against the booth, her jacket stiff with blood and rain as she waited, her SEAL training holding her upright. The city stirred, TVs flickering in windows, and she glimpsed her face on a corner store screen, WSTN breaking the story, Hayes' voice crackling through static. "I planted the wallet, burned your shack, bombed your rally, forged it." Steelton erupted, shouts echoing from the west side, horns blaring as the broadcast spread. Cops flooded the streets, their faces grim, some peeling off badges, their loyalty to Hayes cracking under his own words. The mayor's voice cut in, shaky, promising a probe, his polished suit a lie against the city's rot. Isha stood, her limp easing as she moved toward the precinct's edge, her eyes glinting with a victory she could barely feel. Steelton turned. Neighbors who'd spat traitor now whispered her name, their anger shifting to Hayes. She'd won, her tape a sledgehammer smashing his empire, cops turning on him, the feds circling as his confession looped on air. She'd thought it'd end him, her brother's death the price for justice, and she leaned against a lamppost, her breath clouding in the night, her chest swelling with a hollow triumph. Hayes was cornered, his lies exposed, his badge a noose tightening around his neck. Then the ground shook, a roar splitting the air as a fireball bloomed from the precinct 2 blocks away, its brick walls collapsing in a storm of dust and flame. Aisha stumbled, her ears ringing, her eyes wide as screams pierced the night, the blast's heat washing over her even from a distance. Steelton froze, then chaos erupted, people running, glass shattering, the precinct a crater spitting smoke, and ash. She limped closer, her heart pounding, her mind racing as sirens wailed, too late to matter. Bodies lay scattered, uniforms torn, blood pooling on asphalt, dozens dead, cops who'd turned on Hayes now victims of his wrath. She reached the edge of the destruction, her boots crunching glass, her breath shallow as she saw it. A bomb, bigger than the rallies, rigged with precision she recognized from her SEAL days. Hayes, he'd planted it, his final strike, a massacre to flip her victory into ruin. News vans swarmed, their cameras catching her silhouette against the flames, and a reporter's voice boomed through a live feed. Aisha Brooks linked to precinct explosion. Evidence found, her prints on debris. She froze, her blood icing. As cops turned, their eyes narrowing, guns drawing despite the tape's truth still ringing in their ears, Aisha backed away, her hands raised, her voice lost in the chaos as they shouted, "Freeze!" She saw it then, shrapnel staged with her prints, a frame-up Hayes had planned, his reach a ghost haunting the wreckage. Steelton swayed again, the mayor retracting his probe, his voice trembling on air. "She's a terrorist," Hayes warned. "Huss?" The city's rage turned, neighbors who'd cheered her now screaming her name in hate, their trust a ash heap mirroring her home. She'd broadcast his confession, thought she'd won, but he'd flipped it with a blast that dwarfed the rally, his vengeance a tidal wave drowning her stand. She ran, her body screaming, her ribs cracking with each step as cops gave chase, their bullets pinging off steel. The river loomed, its dark waters a lifeline, and she dove behind a dumpster, her breath ragged, her mind reeling. Hayes was alive, presumed. Dead in the blast, but she knew better. His smirk a shadow she'd seen too often. He'd rigged this, staged her as the villain. His bomb a lie to bury her deeper than the traitor tag or the mill's bats. Her tape played on, a faint echo against the news, branding her a killer. Her victory flipped into a nightmare that killed. Dozens more. Aisha crawled, her hands scraping asphalt, her blood mixing with the rain as she slipped into a drainage pipe, its mouth a refuge from the hunt. The city roared above, choppers buzzing, their spotlights slashing the dark, but she was invisible. Her SEAL stealth her last shield. She'd thought she'd ended him, turned Steelton against his corruption, but he'd struck back, his power. Her beast she couldn't slay. The precinct's dead, cops who doubted him, were his pawns, their blood a message. No one crossed him and lived. She'd won the confession, a crack in his armor only to see him widen it into a chasm swallowing her whole. Her chest heaved, grief for Malik mingling with rage as she pressed against the pipe's cold wall, her eyes glinting through the dark. Steelton had betrayed her, swayed by his lie despite the tape, their fickle trust a knife in her back. She'd lost her brother, her home, her name, now this, a city mourning her as a monster. Hayes had flipped her strike into his triumph, his bomb a masterstroke that dwarfed every blow before, the fire, the beating, the rallies dead. She'd thought she'd cornered him, but he'd outplayed her. His hate a force she couldn't match. Aisha's hands clenched, her nails digging into her palms, drawing fresh blood as she steadied her breath. She'd survived deserts, jungles, men with guns and bombs. Hayes was no different, a coward with a bigger blast. She'd hide, heal, find Tyrell and Jamal, and prove this too was his doing. The tape was out, a seed planted, and she'd water it with his ruin. Her body ached, her spirit dented, but her seal fire burned. A vow sealed in the precinct's ash. She'd rise from this, hunt him down, and end him. Steelton had turned, but she wouldn't. Her war a flame he'd never snuff. She slid deeper, into the pipe. The river's murmur a faint pulse as the city raged above. Its betrayal a weight she'd carry. Hayes had won this round. His explosion a lie that buried her deeper than the cell or the feds. But she'd claw out, her resolve a blade sharpened by loss. She'd thought she'd broken him, but he'd broken Steelton instead. And now she was alone, a fugitive in a city that hated her. The night closed in, her blood dripping into the dark, her eyes fierce as she vanished, a ghost he'd never catch, yet. Aisha Brooks crouched in the drainage pipe, her blood-streaked hands pressed against the cold concrete, her breath a shallow rasp as Steelton's chaos roared above. The precinct explosion had flipped her victory. Hayes's confession broadcast. Live into a nightmare, his bomb killing dozens and framing her with planted evidence, turning the city she'd fought for into a mob baying for her head. Her brother Malik's death in the warehouse showdown still bled in her chest, his blood a stain she'd never wash off. And now she was alone, battered, her seal body pushed beyond its limits. Officer Victor Hayes had outplayed her, his final. Strike a massacre that buried her under lies deeper than the fire, the beating or the rally's bomb. But she wasn't done. Not yet. The pipe's damp walls closed in, the river's murmur a faint pulse as choppers buzzed overhead, their spotlights slashing the night, cops and feds hunting her as a terrorist. She'd lost everything. Her home, torched, her brother gunned down, her seal honor twisted into a traitor's smear. And Steelton had turned, its people swallowing Hayes's lie despite the tape proving his crimes. Her ribs screamed, her arm oozed, but her mind stayed sharp, a blade honed by 20 years of covert ops. She couldn't fight a city, not like this, not with her face on every screen, her print staged in the precinct's ash. She needed a reset, something Hayes wouldn't see coming. Aisha crawled deeper, her boots scraping sludge until she reached a grate overlooking the riverbank, its dark waters glinting under a half moon. She paused, her hands trembling as she pulled the burner phone from her pocket, its cracked screen flickering as she dialed Tyrell. His voice answered, hoarse with panic. Aisha, they're saying you blew the precinct. Where are you? She swallowed, her throat dry, her words clipped. River drain, west side. Need a car, gas can fast, trust me. He hesitated, then agreed, his dreads rustling as he moved. On it. Stay alive. She waited, her body slumped against the grate, her eyes tracing the river's flow as her plan took shape. A SEAL tactic, bold, final. Hayes thought he'd won, his bomb a checkmate, but she'd flip the board, vanish in a way that'd haunt him. Tyrell arrived 20 minutes later, his aunt's old sedan rolling up, its engine coughing as he tossed a gas can through the grate. What's this for? He asked, his voice low, his eyes wide at her bloodied state. She grabbed it, her grip firm despite the pain. You'll see. Get back to Jamal. Keep the tape alive. I'll find you. He nodded, reluctant, and drove, off, his taillights fading into the dark. Aisha worked fast, her hands steady as she pried the grate loose with a rusted shard, slipping out onto the bank. The sedan sat 50 yards off, parked by Tyrell before he left, its keys in the ignition, a gift she'd used to end this. She poured gas over the seats, her blood dripping into the mix, a signature Hayes would recognize. She staged it, her jacket torn on the wheel, her burner smashed on the dash, then struck a match, the flame flaring as she tossed it in. The car erupted, a fireball roaring into the sky, its heat searing her face as she stumbled back, the river's edge swallowing. Her shadow. She dove in, the icy water shocking her wounds, and swam downstream, her strokes weak but relentless, her SEAL training driving her through the current. The blast lit Steelton, sirens screaming as cops swarmed the wreck, their beams catching the charred husk, her DNA a beacon in the flames. She surfaced a mile down, her body trembling, her lungs burning as she dragged herself onto a muddy bank, the city's glow faint behind her. News spread fast, WSTN cutting in, the anchor's voice grim. Aisha Brooks presumed dead in fiery crash, evidence suggesting suicide after precinct bombing. Steelton mourned, its streets quiet, some weeping for the hero they'd betrayed, others cursing the terrorist they'd hunted. The tape looped, Hayes' confession a ghost in the chaos, and cracks widened. Cops doubting, feds digging, the mayor sweating as protests flared anew. Aisha hid in a fisherman's shack, its walls weathered, its roof leaking as she bandaged, her wounds with rags, her breath steadying. She'd faked it, her death a mask, her blood in the car a lie to flip Hayes' game. Steelton grieved her, a martyr now, her name a rallying cry as the tape's truth resurfaced, Terrell and Jamal pushing it hard. She watched from the shadows, a week passing in silence, her body healing, her spirit hardening as the city turned. Investigations spun, Hayes' confession unmasking his empire, cops flipping, his bribes exposed. He was alive, she knew it, hiding, his bomb a desperate play that had backfired. Then it broke. Raids hit Steelton, feds storming a safe house on the east side, dragging Hayes out, his uniform gone, his buzz cut matted with sweat. His smirk was dead, his blue eyes hollow as cuffs snapped on, his crew ratting him out, the tapes echo a noose he couldn't slip. WSTN aired it live, the anchor's voice sharp. Victor Hayes arrested, confession confirmed, precinct bomb his doing. Aisha Brooks cleared posthumously. A hero wronged. Steelton roared, protests swelling, his power stripped, his name ash as the city mourned her death with vigils, candles flickering on the west side where she'd rallied them. Aisha stood at the shack's window, her silhouette a ghost against the glass, her braided hair loose, her eyes glinting with a victory bitter as Malik's blood. She'd won. Hayes fell, his empire crumbled, Steelton's betrayal flipped into justice, but at a cost that hollowed. Her? She'd faked her death, vanished in fire, a twist he'd never foreseen, her seal mask intact as she watched him dragged away. The city thought her gone, a martyr they'd failed, but she lived, her war shifting from his ruin to the system's rot. She'd lost her brother, her home, her name sacrifices that fueled her vow to keep fighting, unseen, a shadow they'd never catch. She packed her bag rags, a knife, a map, her body scarred but strong, her limp fading as she stepped into the night, the river's murmur her guide. Steelton's lights faded behind her, its vigils a faint glow, and she moved north, her stride firm, her mind clear. Hayes was down, his hate a pyre she'd lit, but the system that birthed him stood, a beast she'd dismantle piece by piece. Her war wasn't over Malik's death, the rally's dead. The precinct's ash demanded more, and she'd fight it her way, a seal reborn in the dark. The city settled, its rage cooling, Hayes' trial looming as evidence piled his voice, his prints, his crew's confessions, sealing his fate. Aisha vanished, her death a shock that lingered, her survival a secret Terrell and Jamal kept, their eyes haunted but proud as they pushed her truth. Steelton mourned her, a hero they'd lost, unaware she walked free, her fury a flame no cage could hold. She'd flipped Hayes' victory into his ruin, her sacrifice a blow that echoed, but her fight stretched beyond him, a vow to the dead she'd honor. The night swallowed her, her boots silent on the road, her eyes fierce as she faded, a reckoning he'd never outrun. Aisha Brooks's journey in White Cop lies about black woman in court, not knowing she's a high-ranking Navy SEAL, unveils profound truths about resilience, systemic injustice, and the cost of fighting back. Her story teaches us that strength isn't just physical, it's the unyielding spirit that rises from ashes, whether it's a burned home or a brother's blood. Aisha, a retired SEAL, faced relentless racial venom from Officer Victor Hayes, who wielded power to frame, beat, and bomb her world into ruin. Her lesson is clear. Courage means standing tall when the odds stack higher with every blow. Yet, it's a brutal reminder that justice isn't guaranteed. Steelton turned on her despite Hayes' taped confession, swayed by his lies and a precinct's ashes. This exposes the fragility of trust in a system rigged to protect its own, where truth can be drowned by louder deceit. Aisha's persistence, flipping each defeat into a sharper resolve shows that fighting isn't about winning every battle, it's about enduring the war. Her faked death to outmaneuver Hayes underscores a final truth. Survival sometimes demands sacrifice, a bitter pill when the enemy's hate outlives the fight. We learn that racism's roots run deep, twisting even victories into losses. But one woman's fire can spark change, even if it's a flicker in the dark. What's your takeaway from Aisha's struggle? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think her grit inspires hope. Hit like if Hayes' downfall satisfies you. Subscribe for more tales of defiance and share to spread her story. Thanks for joining this journey. May you find strength to face your own battles.